Releasing in 2003 from the same producers of Age of Empires and the lead designer of Civilization II, Rise of Nations was an ambitious title. It is a game that took different elements from various different sources and attempted to blend them into one super RTS game. But does this make Rise of Nations something of a chimera? Or maybe it's more of a Frankenstein's monster? I'm Strat Tom, and this is the classic review of Rise of Nations. The premise of Rise of Nations is similar to that of many an RTS game. You select a nation and try to make it rise to power. Rise of Nations. Simple, huh? Your nation will start in the ancient era, and it's up to you to collect resources, develop your cities, and improve your nation through the researching of various tech upgrades, taking your nation right up to the modern era. The thing about Rise of Nations is that it really is a jack of all trades. It has taken inspiration from a litany of games, and that does create an interesting style and tone which is, ironically, quite unique. You can choose to play on a variety of different campaigns, the main one simply being a world domination campaign where you move your forces around a very Risk-style map and attempt to conquer the world, moving through the ages as you go. You can also choose a variety of smaller, more focused campaigns, such as the conquests of Alexander the Great or the Napoleonic Wars. My only issue with this is that every era and every faction is so underdeveloped. With the exception of a handful of unique units, some minor buffs and some aesthetic differences, every nation is the same. There is very little reason to go back and play the game again as a different faction. Also, like the Civilization series, Rise of Nations attempts to give you multiple ways to win. But unlike Civilization, the military route is the only one worth bothering with. Just build an army and conquer your rivals. That's really the only way anyone's going to play this game. Gameplay is your standard RTS affair. You have workers that build your cities and other important buildings. Not only this, but they can build and then work at resource buildings which allow you to collect things like food, wood and stone. Later, resources like oil becomes available and you will need to acquire these to build the late game motorised units. Once you have those troops at your disposal, I think the combat can be pretty good in places. One thing I always hated about Age of Empires is how the artillery didn't need to be deployed and could essentially do hit and run attacks. In Rise of Nations, tactically deploying and supporting your troops is important. On top of this, there's things like supply trains that you can include to ensure your armies don't suffer from attrition in enemy territory. Stuff like this makes Rise of Nations an engaging experience, but it's not the whole story. Rise of Nations also includes something that I rarely see done well: a unit cap. I often think that a unit cap is a sign of poorly balanced resource collection. The amount of resources that you are able to collect and successfully harvest should be the only cap you have on units, in my opinion. It puts a greater emphasis on being efficient, and it creates a viable strategy to hurt your enemies, choking off their access to resources. It means that the entire game map is important, not just where your cities or bases are. In Rise of Nations, I would quickly reach the unit cap, and so, in most games, I had nothing to spend my resources on other than research, and money becomes no object in those instances. That does lead itself to a tedious situation where you just throw the biggest army you can at your enemies, with a ton of troops lined up at your unit production facilities, ready to replace any fallen troops. It can become a slog, and believe me, Rise of Nations becomes a slog all too often when trying to take cities from your enemies. In terms of the research, I think Rise of Nations saw itself as the RTS equivalent of the Civilization series, moving through human history in a variety of different eras. But where Civilization has a tech tree, Rise of Nations has a tech potted plant. It is so painfully lacking in any depth or detail, especially when held next to the Civilization games, the series that it is clearly trying to emulate. There are 5 different areas of research. When you have enough of those to the requisite levels, you can then advance to the next era. This means that you can upgrade your troops to the next level, upgrade some of your buildings, and build the next set of wonders. But that's not much, and as I said earlier, there isn't any real variety from faction to faction. Where Rise of Nations is at its best is in the places where it isn't copying other series. Honestly, the most fun I have with this game are the arcadey style games. There are certain specific rule sets you can choose to play with. The Barbarian at the Gates matches are a favourite of mine, where you are forced to fight a 3-on-1 battle against other nations, but you start at a higher tech level than your rivals. You might be outnumbered, but they're outgunned. It's a really cool take on the standard RTS formula, and that is just one of a number of different rules and game types that you can play with. It is these that add replayability to this game. You'll want to go through and try them all. The presentation of Rise of Nations is a real 50-50 affair. I like ending on positives, so let's start with the negatives. The music is pretty boring, I guess, and the graphics they're okay for its age. It is the animations and the sound design that really let down Rise of Nations. They're really quite poor when taken on their own. Your units move and fight in this really clunky looking way. Everything's so weird and repetitive and robotic. It's off-putting. The sound design too is pretty weak and generic. The noise that you hear upon the death of your infantry sounds like a strange croaking noise that no human being has ever made before. However, my biggest issue is how these animations and the sound design work in tandem, or to put it another way, the way they don't work in tandem. When watching units fight, you will get your weird, janky animations and they'll be accompanied by generic war sounds. But the sounds of gunfire and explosions don't match up with the gunfire and explosions that you see happening on screen. It's like war noises are being pumped in separately. It's not good enough. It makes the game seem cheap and amateurish. I mean, you can't even put this down to age. This game came out in 2003. Command & Conquer Generals came out in 2003, and the difference is astounding between the two. But on to the positives. Where the presentation does excel is in the design work of the game. One thing I absolutely love is the variety of aesthetics on display from the various factions. This may well be the case of papering over the cracks, as this is the deepest way in which they vary the factions, but it's still impressive. The looks and designs of the same unit can be totally different depending on their culture and background, and the quality of the design work is as impressive as the variety. Graphically, yes, it may have aged, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the effort that went into making the game look great. This use of graphic design gives a real and sorely needed burst of life to the game. For some reason, Rise of Nations is lauded as a classic of the strategy genre. If you search Rise of Nations online, you will see 9 out of 10 ratings, 93% scores, 5 stars. I'm confused as to how this came to be. Now, I'm not saying that Rise of Nations is a terrible game, far from it, but it does have a whole host of issues and problems that you can't wave away by saying it's old. there are games that are its contemporaries or even older than it that are far superior games. So let's have a closer look. The premise, the pros, a variety of focused campaigns, the cons, underdeveloped factions, and only the military victories really seem viable. The gameplay, pros, there are some fun arcade-style game modes that are a cool twist on the standard RTS genre. The cons, poorly balanced resource collection that relies on unit caps to stop you becoming overpowered, and a shallow and poorly thought out tech tree. The presentation, pros, excellent graphic design work that creates a sense of variety between the nations. The cons, strange and clunky animations and sound design. I said earlier that Rise of Nations was a jack of all trades. It would seem that they didn't look at the second half of that idiom when designing this game. Jack of all trades, master of none. The campaign map is clearly modelled off Risk. The gameplay like Age of Empires or in the late game Command & Conquer. The biggest inspiration was obviously the Civilization series, with Rise of Nations focusing on the ever-pressing need to modernise and upgrade. But in trying to be like all of these great games, it falls short of all of them. Some people, a lot of people in fact, have the audacity to put the title of Rise of Nations next to all those other games I just mentioned, as if it's on par with them. It isn't. It's not one of the all-time greats. It's average. It's alright. It's a 5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. What did you think of Rise of Nations? I imagine I might have upset some people. If you're one of the many people who adore this game, then tell me why in the comments. Who knows, maybe you'll convince me. Sound off in the comments below and tell me what should get the classic review treatment in future. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I'm Strat Tom, and I'll see you next time.